The cursor blinked. Once, twice. A rhythmic, mocking pulse against the white void of the screen. Ethan did not move. He kept his fingers pressed hard against the edge of the desk until his knuckles turned white. This was the 5th time. 5 years of late nights, 5 years of code, 5 years of planning all dismantled in a single keystroke. The apartment was pitch black, save for the harsh blue light spilling from the monitor. He listened to the hum of the cooling fan, the only sound in the room. It sounded like a countdown. He looked at the project dashboard. Total users, 0. Total revenue, 0. The air in the room felt thick, stagnant, as if the failure itself had physical mass. He pushed his chair back, the wheels scraping harshly against the floorboards. He had spent his entire career obsessed with precision, with algorithms that promised logical outcomes, yet his own life felt like a chaotic, unsolvable error. He stared at the empty space where his future was supposed to be. 5 years, gone. The silence grew heavy, pressing against his chest, making every breath feel like a deliberate, difficult choice. His gaze drifted from the screen to a stack of books piled haphazardly near his lamp. He reached out, his hand brushing the spine of a worn volume. He pulled it closer and flipped the pages until his eyes landed on a highlighted passage. It spoke of adversity holding the seed of an equal or greater benefit. Ethan scoffed, the sound sharp and brittle in the quiet room. He tossed the book onto the floor, the thud echoing in the dark. It lay face down, spine cracked. He turned back to the monitor, intent on ignoring the sentiment, but the words refused to dissipate. They sat in the back of his mind, an irritating logical variable he had not accounted for. He stared at the empty screen again. He tried to calculate the odds of that specific sentence appearing now, of all times. His fingers tapped a restless rhythm against the wood of the desk. He leaned down and picked up the book again. He did not read it to find comfort. He read it to find the flaw in the logic. He traced the text with his thumb, his brow furrowing as he began to weigh the possibility that his failure was not a dead end, but a set of raw, unrefined data. He opened a blank spreadsheet. The grid of empty cells glowed with potential. He did not name the file after a new business venture. He titled it Postmortem. With a steady hand, he typed the first entry. Startup 1. Market demand, null. He moved to the next row. Startup 2. Flawed business model. Startup 3. Revenue, 0. Each keystroke stripped away the sting of failure, replacing it with the sterile, ordered logic of a quantitative analyst. He was no longer a man defeated by his own life. He was a researcher processing a corrupted data set. He categorized the feedback, isolating variables that had caused each collapse. He created columns for timing, product market fit, and operational friction. The paralysis that had gripped him for weeks began to thaw. He was dissecting his past with the same precision he used for his firm's algorithms. He scrolled down, adding notes to every cell, filling the screen with cold, hard facts. He realized he had been looking for a miracle when he should have been looking for the error code. As the list grew, the weight in his chest lightened. He had stopped running from the wreckage and started measuring the blast radius. He was finally back in control. Weeks later, the rhythm of his day job took over. Ethan sat at his desk, processing a massive client dataset. Across the room, his manager stood over an open laptop, brow furrowed. The manager clicked through 10 different tabs, squinting at the screen, clearly lost in the sheer volume of information. Ethan watched the cycle repeat. Click, scroll, sigh, click again. The data was there, but the meaning was buried under layers of unnecessary complexity. Ethan stopped his own work and stood up. He walked over, his eyes scanning the monitors. He saw the disconnect immediately. It was not a lack of information. It was a total absence of synthesis. The manager was drowning in raw numbers, unable to find the single metric that mattered. The room seemed to sharpen in focus. Ethan traced the path from the raw data to the manager's confused expression. The gap was wide, gaping, and entirely bridgeable. He did not see a problem to solve for his firm. He saw a product that needed to exist. The spreadsheet of his past failures flashed through his mind, not as a memory, but as a filter. He understood exactly what the missing link looked like. The noise of the office faded as the architecture of his next venture began to assemble in his head. Ethan returned to his apartment, but he did not rush to his laptop. He spent the first hour clearing his desk. He swept away old notebooks, discarded prototypes, and empty coffee cups, leaving only the monitor and his keyboard. The space felt different. He opened a new directory. He did not name the project after a grand vision or a market disruption. He named it simply Bridge. The name was a functional description of the gap he had witnessed at the office. He began to write the foundational code, his fingers moving with a rhythm he had never possessed before. There was no tremor in his hands. There was no frantic energy. Every line he typed felt like a structural support beam being locked into place. He tested each function against the lessons he had logged in his spreadsheet. If a block of code felt too complex, he deleted it immediately. He was no longer trying to impress an imaginary audience. He was building a utility for a specific, observable person. The hours passed in a blur of focused, quiet labor. He felt the weight of the past 5 years, not as a burden, but as a foundation. He knew exactly where the cracks were, and he was building around them, one precise command at a time. The work shifted from creation to the grueling process of refinement. Ethan lived in a cycle of prototype, test, and discard. He pulled up his spreadsheet of past failures, a roadmap of every wrong turn he had ever taken. When he reached the pricing module, the code felt heavy. He remembered the mistake of his second venture, where he had misread the customer's willingness to pay. He deleted the entire pricing logic and rebuilt it from scratch, stripping away the complex tiers that had once confused his users. Next, he tackled the marketing hooks. He looked at the errors of his third startup, where he had buried the value proposition in jargon. He rewrote the interface, forcing every call to action to be visible in under 3 seconds. The apartment grew colder as the weeks bled into months. His screen became a battlefield of micro-adjustments. Every time a feature felt too clever, he cut it. Every time a button felt redundant, he removed it. The pressure began to mount. He was no longer building a tool, he was sharpening a blade. His deadlines tightened. He spent 3 days straight debugging the final integration, surviving on cold coffee and the rhythmic hum of the server. The finish line was visible now, looming and sharp, and he knew he could not afford a single mistake. Ethan hit the deploy button at midnight. The screen flickered, processed the request, and returned a simple, green status. Live. He sat back. The silence in the room was absolute, bordering on heavy. He waited for the inevitable error report, the familiar crash of a system under load. Instead, the monitor hummed with steady power. 10 seconds passed. Then, a single notification pinged. A new user. He blinked. Another ping followed, then 3 more in rapid succession. The refresh rate on his dashboard spiked. The numbers climbed from units to tens, then hundreds. His phone buzzed against the desk, vibrating with a constant, rhythmic intensity. The email alerts began to stack, a digital waterfall of confirmation. He leaned in, his eyes darting across the real-time data streams. He had expected a trickle. He was witnessing a flood. Every connection was holding. Every algorithm was executing exactly as he had designed. He refreshed the page again. The user count jumped by another 1,000. He stood up, his chair clattering back against the wall, but he did not move away from the glow. He watched the graph. The line was moving upward with a vertical, undeniable momentum. The years of silence had been replaced by the steady, overwhelming pulse of success. The initial surge was not a fluke. By the second day, the traffic patterns shifted from a spike to a sustained climb. Ethan moved his workstation to the center of the room, his eyes locked on the revenue dashboard. The numbers were no longer just data points. They were a living map of his success. He watched the conversion rates tick upward, each percentage point representing thousands of active users. The load on his server pushed the hardware to its limit. He heard the fans spinning at maximum speed, a mechanical roar that filled the apartment. He spent hours in a fever of optimization, tuning the database queries to keep pace with the influx. Every time a bottleneck appeared, he dismantled it with the same surgical precision he had applied to his earlier prototypes. The revenue figures broke through the ceiling he had set in his projections. Monthly recurring income surged, scaling faster than his most optimistic algorithms predicted. He stopped checking the clock. He stopped measuring the days. He existed only in the space between the data and the result. The screen glowed with the steady, aggressive incline of a growth chart that refused to plateau. He saw the logic finally hold. The chaos of his past was being overwritten by the cold, undeniable reality of profit. The office was quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioning. The investor leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the monitor where the growth charts traced their sharp upward path. He tapped a finger against the mahogany desk, his expression unreadable. "You were failing for 5 years," the investor said, his voice measured. "Then you built this. What changed? What was the pivot point?" Ethan did not look at the charts. He reached for his laptop, closed the browser, and opened a file that had not been touched in months. He turned the screen around. It was not a projection or a business plan. It was a list. Rows of failed startups, columns of specific errors, and cells filled with raw, brutal data points from every loss he had endured. The investor squinted, scrolling through the entries labeled by revenue, market demand, and flawed modeling. Ethan pointed to a specific cell. "I stopped running from the failure," he said. "I started extracting its data." The investor stopped scrolling. He looked at the list, then back at the charts, finally seeing the architecture of the success that sat before him. The spreadsheet remained open, a clear, empirical map of every misstep that had paved the way to this moment. The office door clicked shut. The investor was gone, leaving the room to the hum of the server and the evening light stretching across the floor. Ethan sat alone, the spreadsheet still glowing on his screen. He scrolled through the final entry, then back to the first. He looked at the data points that had once felt like scars. Now, they were merely coordinates on a map. He traced the progression from the early, blind mistakes to the calculated precision of his current platform. He did not feel the weight of those years anymore. He felt the cold, hard logic of the process. Each failure had been a necessary experiment, a variable he had to isolate to find the final solution. The frustration that had once paralyzed his hands had long since evaporated, replaced by a steady, quiet clarity. He tapped the trackpad, and the screen went dark. He stood up, walked to the window, and watched the city lights flicker to life below. He realized he had not succeeded in spite of his failures, but because of them. The path was not a straight line, but a sum of every lesson he had dared to document. He turned away from the window, pulled his chair in, and rested his hands on the desk. The room was silent, and for the first time in 5 years, the silence was not heavy.